My name is Monica Wilkinson Kelly. I'm the archivist at the Edith B. Ford Memorial Library in Ovid, New York. This interview is being conducted as part of the Cayuga and Seneca Lakes Agriculture and Craft Beverage Memory Project. Today is October 8, 2020. I'm interviewing Chuck Tauck of Sheldrake Point Winery. Good morning, Chuck.
Good morning. My name's Chuck Tauck. We've been involved at Sheldrake Point Winery since 1997. It's been quite a journey, and we're happy to be part of this craft beverage history project.
Well, thank you for participating. So, where are you located exactly?
The winery is located on the western shore of Cayuga Lake, about halfway between Ithaca and Geneva. At Sheldrake Point. It's a prominent point of land on the lake. In the town of Ovid. Ovid stretches between both Cayuga Lake and Seneca Lake, and we sit right here on the shore.
Can you tell me about your background?
My background, well...
Education?
Yes. I grew up in Connecticut. Did undergraduate at the University of Vermont in Burlington, big ag school. Interestingly, in 1973, I was not able to get into that school in their College of Regular Liberal Arts, so I chose to get in the back door through the Agricultural College. And my advisor was the dean of the college. He wasn't happy with me when I announced to him that I was going to transfer out of agriculture as soon as I can and go into the business school. And in his frustration, he forced me to take plant science and soil science and animal husbandry, all of which I didn't realize I might use in a future career. And here I am, 40 years later. In terms of how we got here, when I say we, I mean my wife and I, we live in Ithaca. We moved from Connecticut in the early 1990s. I came back to Cornell to get a graduate degree at the hotel school. At the time, I had been about 20 years in the vacation tour industry, basically designing and operating vacation tours all around North America, and then we expanded worldwide. And the opportunity to move here took us away from what I refer to as the I-95 fast lane corridor outside New York City to a little bit more bucolic and sane lifestyle for our children who were young at the time. And in the years following the graduate degree, I graduated in 94, we stayed here. I went back to work for that international travel company, but then chose to depart in 1996. At the time, we really didn't know what we might be doing. I was in my mid-40s at the time, and early 40s, really. And as we considered directions and would discuss among ourselves sort of categories of careers that we might look at, tourism was one that had always sort of been in the blood in all that I had done previous to that. And every time we talked about horticulture as a category, even though we weren't farmers, we found ourselves sort of lingering on that concept. And it was shortly thereafter that I started to push on my awareness of wineries in this region, in the Finger Lakes region, and the fact that they really are a marriage of tourism and horticulture or agriculture. And yet I was taken by the fact that so many wineries sort of sit up on windy ridgetops with sort of distant views of lakes, and it struck me that so few of them happen to be on a lake, and yet the lakes are such a significant element of this region. And, long story short, spent some time out at UC Davis, sort of the Cornell of California when it comes to wine education. Took a course out there through their extension service. It wasn't about grape growing. It wasn't about winemaking. That course was about the business of wine and regulation and accounting and distribution and the kinds of things that I, as halfway through my career, felt if I went and found those things interesting about this industry, I might find myself interested in pursuing. And it was while I was there that I met one of only 3 other people from New York out of the 90 that were in that summertime class in 1997. Only 3 others were from New York, one of whom was a guy named Bob Medill, who was still here in the Finger Lakes. And Bob was involved with a small group of people who had bought a abandoned farm on the shores of Cayuga Lake, where we are now, and we're in the process of turning it into a winery. And so again, long story short, we pursued that introduction and joined this group of people who were in the process of turning what was a former dairy farm and orchard into a vineyard and winery. It was very much the beginning. We came in as part of a group at the time of 9 or 10 different people. Many had put little bits of their own savings and monies into cobbling together this business plan. The business plan had been written by a guy named Greg Sandor. He and his wife Bernie lived in Ithaca. He originally wrote their business plan to start a winery in Maryland, and then stumbled on this site. Interestingly, they had traveled all around the Finger Lakes as part of his graduate education with Bob Poole up at Cornell, Geneva. He was getting a graduate degree in viticulture. His undergrad had been from Fresno State out in California. And Bernie, his wife, who grew up in Long Island, really didn't, I think she liked the idea, but she really didn't want to live in the Finger Lakes. She liked the beaches of Long Island. And so the only place she told her husband that she would be willing to even consider in the Finger Lakes was this area up here around Kidders and Sheldrake. And lo and behold, she was the one who spotted a 1.5-inch ad in the Penny Saver. And that's how Cy Diamond sold this farm. He didn't go to a realtor. He didn't go to a broker. He put a 1.25-inch free ad in the Penny Saver, and Bernie spotted it. And Greg came out here with Bob Poole, and they dug some soil pits to look at the drainage profiles and the soil profiles of this farm to see if it was appropriate for growing grapes. And lo and behold, it was. There's lots of different soils up here, but the primary soil type is Howard gravelly loam, well drained. And they bought the farm with this group of people that they had cobbled together, enthusiasts, interested parties. And we joined them in the fall of 1997. And in the years since, a number of the original group sort of fell off the train, not because of issues. A lot of them, their lives changed and they moved or they got married or priorities changed and they moved on. And so our group got smaller and smaller. And by the early 2000s, really the only ones left were Bob Medill and myself and my wife. And we sort of pushed ahead and planted more and more acreage. We're up to 60 acres of grapes at this point. Our most recent plantings were in 2018. 10 different grape varieties. It took a long time for the buildings to evolve because that costs money. And you also sort of grow into your need, form follows function. And I tell people that I think our biggest aha in the early years was when we turned what was Cy Diamond's old tractor shop, into a tiny little tasting room, and at the time also a cafe with one little bathroom and a tiny little kitchen. That the buses started to show up on the Cayuga Wine Trail, and the throngs of people overran our little tasting room. Our water system, and that's stretching what we had at the time in calling it a system, and our waste systems were just not adequate. And I tell people that we came to the same conclusion that Roy Scheider came to in the movie Jaws. I think we need a bigger boat. And so a period of expansion took place and upgrade. A lot of it's just infrastructure. A lake-sourced water system with purification that takes us up to a state standard. It's required. It's in. It's been in for 20 years. Waste systems to handle effluent, both from winery operations and from visitor traffic, is in. And, we're not sending anything bad to the lake. And over time, the farm has evolved. Bob left us back in 2013, I think. And so really it's just my wife and I who own it now. But we have a team of people, many of whom have been with us for almost 20 years. Our vineyard manager, David Wyman, came with us in 1999. And I tell people, and I think it's accurate, Dave knows more about what's going on underneath that vineyard as well as what he knows that goes on the vineyard. And when I say that, it has to do with water flow. There's a wonderful spring up here, Sheldrake Spring, served the old hotel back in the 1800s, and is still a source of beautiful water. And that water's coming from somewhere, and it's flowing underneath this vineyard, and we can see, and Dave can see, its impact on on locations and blocks inside the vineyard. And we've learned to grow with that and live with that over time. So that's huge depth of experience in our vineyard management. And in our winery, Dave Breeden has been with us since 2002 making wine. And there's an adage, wine is made in the vineyard, and between the two of them, working with each year's vintage and what Mother Nature throws at us each year, we think we've been able to produce a wonderful product and are a credit to this burgeoning Finger Lakes wine region.
You said you purchased the property in 1997, and
actually 1996, but
97.
It took a while to get things cleaned up. The first grapes went in the spring of 97, 5 acres.
And that takes 3 years to produce fruit, correct? Right. So how many cases did you produce the first year, the first vintage?
Gosh, I don't even remember how many cases in the first vintage. I'm going to guess it would have been measured in the in the low hundreds, because yes, the amount of fruit that came off this property in 2000 was quite limited. And so, like many, we had been and continued to buy fruit from others. Our production back then was probably measured in the low thousands of cases that we were selling in the early 2000s.
And what is your current sale?
We're producing about 6,000 cases of wine from this vineyard that we bottle and sell. The capacity of the vineyard of 60 acres and the 200 to 250 odd tons that it produces could produce about 15,000 cases, but we sell a lot of fruit to others. And we make some wine for others. So we're balancing our creation of Sheldrake Point wine with the demand that we assume the market will create and what it actually creates.
And what types of grapes do you grow here in the vineyard?
What types of grapes? Well, there's 10 varieties. The biggest plantings are Riesling, Cabernet Franc, Pinot Noir. Some of the more, I think the wines that have performed well consistently year in and year out are Gewürztraminer, Pinot Gris, Gamay Noir. Now, we do a little bit of Chardonnay, we grow Merlot, we grow Muscat, we grow Cabernet Sauvignon. And these find their way into wines depending on season and vintage. Some of those noble red varieties that we've all heard of can be a challenge to ripen in the Finger Lakes. When we have a hot, dry summer like this one, Cabernet Sauvignon, Merlot, even Cabernet Franc are beautiful. And they will find their way into a varietal wine in a vintage like this. If we have a cooler, wetter summer when things like the Merlot or the Cabernet Sauvignon aren't of a quality that we're real proud of, those wines might get blended into something else or go away rather than putting them out there when they don't represent.
You also produce ice wines. Can you tell me about those?
Sure. So ice wine. Bob Medill, whose name I mentioned, is a Canadian and spent a bit of his earlier years working in the Niagara Peninsula for wineries in the Niagara Peninsula. And in 2000, Bob suggested that we set aside some Riesling grapes after the traditional harvest. Now, mind you, it's 2000, so these are baby vines. They're only 3 years old. And in the traditional way, we let those grapes sit there and await a cold enough night. Typically, it's at night when the temperature drops between 12 and 18 degrees Fahrenheit. It's a window of temperature during which, chemistry of what's happening in the grapes, the sweet essence, the really concentrated sweet essence of juice doesn't freeze, but the water in the berry does freeze. Below 12 degrees, the juice freezes. Above 18, too much water. And so we went out and harvested this fruit on a cold morning in December of 2000. And pressed that few drops that's in each berry out of that wine and produced a really gorgeous ice wine. And so we did it again. I think the next time we did it was in 2002. And since then, we have most vintages set aside grapes to be harvested for ice wine in the winter. It's always a gamble because even though you set the fruit aside, you put the nets on to keep the birds off, Mother Nature's desire is to just let the fruit rot and go away. And so it's a race with Mother Nature as to how much quality stays in the fruit and when you hit that night when it goes from 12 to 18. Sometimes we've missed it and the fruit just rots and you don't get a harvest, and we tried. Other winters like 2014 when the polar vortex winter, we all remember that one. There were 5 harvests of ice wine that year, and to the point where we were selling ice wine juice to others to make their own ice wine from it. And so the fun part of that is that, we can all try and make ice wine, but when we've gone out to competitions and ratings with our ice wine, it has quite consistently done really well. Whether that's the nature of site or whether that's the nature of technique, it's all a question. But the 2014 year produced an ice wine that won Best in Show at a huge Riesling competition in Australia, with Rieslings and of all styles from all over the world competing. I think 400 different Rieslings, and the Sheldrake Point Wild Ferment ice wine from 2014 took Best in Show. That was a big accolade. Just this month, Wine and Spirits magazine produces their top 100 wines, and Sheldrake Point's 2018 Riesling ice wine is one of the top 100s worldwide, which is a nice accolade, and we're proud of. So,
what do you consider the biggest natural predator or threat to you at this point in the business?
Wow. Biggest threat, natural. So, that would be, to me, that's either critters or it's climate. And so it really is in both categories. Natural threats in the vineyard, critters are an issue, and those include birds, Those include deer, those include raccoons. Let's face it, critters are hungry. It also includes fungus and mildew. You know, our biggest challenge when it comes to disease pressure is fungus and mildew. And we do spray. Hot, dry summers like this reduces the incidence of fungus and mildew. Spray schedule was far reduced. Wet summers, it goes the other way. Fungus and mildew are related a bit to the other natural threat, which is climate change. And, you know, there are pundits who would suggest that while the hotter fringe regions like California might suffer as the planet warms, and that might bode well for areas like the Finger Lakes, who may see fewer, mortality issues, freezing issues. I don't know if that's so true. I think that what we're seeing is the swings of extremes, and extremes can be challenging in growing grapes. You know, extreme moisture. We hear of vineyards, it happens all the time, every summer. Hailstorms. Let's face it, hail's always happened. But if there is a greater frequency of violent thunderstorms as a result of climate change, there's going to be a greater frequency of hail events, which are decimate any agricultural crop. But grapes, you know, you get one shot at your grapes every year. And
were you impacted by the flooding that happened in August 2018?
So 2018, we were not impacted by the flooding that impacted Sheldrake Creek. I mean,
just
immediately next door,
couple
our
hundred
neighbors
feet
are,
away.
15 feet lower, and it was devastating.
As far as economy, how many people do you employ here at Sheldrake Point, seasonally and year-round?
Right. When people ask that question, the immediate response always is too many. But we have 8 people who are full-time, and we probably have 6 who are part-time, year-round. And then in the summer season, we bring in 4 folks from Mexico on an H-2A visa, seasonal worker visa. Same 4 guys. This is their 4th year. And then we probably hire an additional 3 or 4 people that work in the tasting room. And that carries us through the fall. So the payroll might pop up around 20 people at this time of year and shrink to 8 or 10 during the winter.
So how has COVID impacted your business?
COVID. Well, of course, it impacted us in the spring when we were ordered to cease operations. Unlike other businesses that might have enjoyed a lot of traffic in the spring, restaurants and so forth, we don't really see a lot of people in the spring. Maybe during the weekends, but even during weekdays, we don't see so many people. So, yes, it reduced revenues for those months until June. What was interesting is that when we reopened in June with all the rules and, everything's outdoors and tables are spread apart, we, and I think everybody in the Finger Lakes, was surprised to see how many people were coming to visit. People who probably would have otherwise been going to Italy or England or wherever for their summer vacations were hopping in their cars and trying to get out of the cities. And so the subsequent months since June have actually been quite strong for us in terms of visitor sales. We sell our wines through a distributor to stores and restaurants. And store sales have been doing fine. Restaurant sales, of course, are way off. Most of our off-site distribution goes to stores. And so it's actually been a surprisingly strong year for us so far. Our biggest question right now is winter. We will be retreating indoors quite soon. and we can only accommodate so many people indoors. And I think we're going to find ourselves going to a reservation-only process for visitors. So if we don't have room for you, you're basically not going to be able to come in the wintertime. And the only day when that's really going to be an impact is probably Saturdays. Those are the busy days. So I think one thing that we talk about and that I've heard anecdotally from other wineries is that this seated, reservation-controlled pace that we have found ourselves in is actually a much better guest experience. And it's better for the visitor. I think it's better for us and our staff than the old style of crashing into a tasting room and packing them all in and sticking your wine glass in for another sample of something else. And I have a feeling when COVID is over, we're not going to go back. We're going to stick with this process because it's a better guest experience for the visitor. And I think a lot of other wineries are going to do the same.
One thing I wanted to ask you about is your wine library, since we are a library. Can you tell me about that?
Sure. So again, a name I've mentioned a few times, Bob Medill, who is a international wine judge and really is a student of wine. Lived here on the property in a house right over there for a good 10 or 12 years. And that house happens to have a basement that is a beautiful place to store wine and is large and dry. And so he began setting aside a case or two of every wine we made, starting in the beginning. The purpose of the library at the time was really one of research, of trying to create an ability in the future to be able to look back and see how different grape varieties and different decisions in the winery might have impacted a wine's ability to age well or not. And, out of sight, out of mind, this collection of wines kind of grew as the years went on. And we found ourselves 20 years later realizing we had a lot of wine down in that basement, and we began a process of disciplined tastings to go through and line them all up and try and ascertain with a group of people what each vintage wine. We would take a variety. Let's just do dry Rieslings. We'd line up 20 dry Rieslings, 20 years that go back 20 years to try and understand if some of them were worthwhile to offer to the public for sale, if some of them, which ones were really bad. And yes, some didn't do well over time. But it has led us to setting aside more than just a couple cases. Now we set aside, depending on the wine and our assumption of how it will do, we set the wine aside for both understanding of the vintage for the winemakers and for the ability to have it available for sale in the future, because there are people who appreciate aged wines.
And did you, your winemaker, take notes at the time? I was just curious, and make comparisons and jot down temperature and everything on a daily basis? Or
so in winemaking, the answer is yes. There are copious notes about the process and procedure, decisions that were made, and maybe even some anecdotal notes as to why a decision might have been made. Some of it may have had to do with the vineyard and harvest, chemistry. Others might have had to do with challenges that occurred with the wine in the winery. And then in these tastings, 20 years later, we have copious notes. They're tasting notes, though. We're not doing chemistry on the wine. We're simply looking at, aromatics, flavors, mouthfeel, faults, if a wine went faulty. Some of the decisions, some of the learnings had to do with closures, cork. We didn't have screw top back in the day, but we danced with plastic corks and other synthetics early on. We veered from that early on, and it's a good thing, because when you look at old wines under plastic, they didn't really work out.
Didn't work.
Um,
What do you feel is your greatest contribution to the industry?
Greatest contribution to the industry.
Or proudest?
Yeah, I think our focus on producing quality wines in the Finger Lakes that can be appreciated on a world stage. I think the Finger Lakes struggles as a, I don't know the right way to put it, a second tier wine region. We're not Napa, we're not Bordeaux. And yet we have, like many cool climate areas, we have elements that lend some real qualities to the wines we produce. And there are a number of wineries that are devoted to putting their best foot forward in winemaking. And I think we join those other wineries here in the Finger Lakes to say, hey, this region deserves, in the words of Rodney, a little more respect. So,
and what would you tell anybody interested in a career in winemaking or vineyards, management?
Wow. I think it's true in any industry. You have to have a passion for whatever you might choose to do. I mean, ideally, do what you love. There's a lot that's easy to love about this industry. I think one of the beauties of the Finger Lakes as an industry, as a wine industry is, and probably even as a craft beverage industry, is that there's a lot of collegiality and a lot of willingness to work together. Yes, we compete with one another, but at the same time, we work together to create a sort of a common tourism magnet, and my son he worked in California for about 4 or 5 years, and his sense out there was, Dad, it's a little different out here. There isn't quite that same spirit of cooperation and collegiality that we enjoy here in the Finger Lakes. And, that's probably part of our smallness, and it's probably part of our need to work together to gain respect on a world stage.
Is there anything you would like to add to anything that you've said in closing?
Well, it is a history project.
Correct.
And, if there's a pride in what I think we've done over the years, and we hear it from our neighbors, people who've lived here a lot longer than we've been here, who have expressed real appreciation for the fact that we've tried to respect this farm in its roots, restoring some of the old original buildings and enhancing the farm's future so that its history, elements of its history, can kind of live on. Sometimes those aren't the cheapest decisions, and yet it creates a sense of pride and a piece of taking it and then leaving it, because eventually we're not here forever, leaving it for better shape for the future.
I see you have solar panels, and I think I read geothermal heating.
Mm-hmm.
So that's a great
contribution. Dave Wyman, vineyard manager since '99, has always been a proponent of renewable energy, even back before it was kind of becoming fashionable, if you can call it fashionable. But in '04, NYSERDA, New York State, renewable energy group, reduced the grant per watt from $5 to $4 a watt. And it was Dave who came and said, if you want to put up some solar panels, the state is is going to drop their support, let's go for it. And we did. We put 90 solar panels on the old Morton building back in 2004 to try and supplement our electrical usage. And those solar panels have been up there cranking away their kilowatts. You know, it's 15 kilowatts. It's not a lot, but it's a start. And our focus on renewables continued when we completed the new winery building in 2018. When we built that from scratch, we went in and we talked to other wineries in the Finger Lakes. Art Hunt and his daughter are very involved in renewables, and basically put in 6 geothermal wells, and both of those buildings now are all heated and cooled geothermal. And geothermal is really quite appropriate for a wine making facility, because we don't really want the temperature to be much more than about 60 to 65 degrees, and the earth is sitting at 50 to 55. So the energy it takes to change the earth's temperature, either warming it or cooling it, to get to our heating desires is really pretty efficient. And it's a long-term investment, no doubt. The only thing we still use propane for up there is hot water. You can use geothermal to heat hot water. It's not that efficient. And as one plumber told us as we were realizing that geothermal wasn't cutting it for our hot water needs, he said, you know, for hot water, you really got to build a fire. And so we do have small little on-demand propane heaters up there to provide for hot water. We never got rid of the big 500-gallon propane tank. And so Getman's shows up from Ovid or Interlaken or wherever they come down with their big old truck to fill us up once a month. And then I look at the tag on the door, 7 gallons, 6 gallons. I wonder if they're going to someday say, why don't we just come once a year instead of once a month? Anyway.
Well, I think this concludes our interview. Thank you so much for your time, Chuck.
Okay.
Tauck of Sheldrake Point Winery. Today is October 8, 2020. And thank you so much for your history. I appreciate it.
Well, we're glad to participate. I think it's fascinating what you're doing.
Okay. Thank you.